A Nordic island nation, one of the hardest hit by the financial crisis, is now enjoying a fast recovery. A president who was criticized by his peers for blocking repayment bills wins broad support from the public. Join us this week for Ray Chungan's exclusive interview with Olafur Ragnar Grimsson, the president of Iceland, only on Biz Talk. Famous for its cod fishing industry, scenic geysers, moonscape, and the Blue Lagoon, Iceland is in many ways a magical place on Earth. But that enchanting image was shattered in 2008 at the height of the global financial crisis, when the collapse of major Icelandic banks stoked fears that the island nation was teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. This loss of confidence spiraled quickly to the point where the island nation was listed in a hoax auction on eBay in October 2008. After Iceland refused to refund British depositors with accounts with troubled Icelandic lenders, Britain took the rare step of imposing financial sanctions on the country's banking sector, utilizing anti-terrorism legislation. Iceland's government and public responded fiercely to the move, accusing Britain of, quote, bullying. Most Icelanders argue that they should not be penalized for their government's failure to rein in spending and for the excesses of a few banks.
President Grimsson, it's a real privilege having you with us at CCTV.
Well, it's a great pleasure to appear again on your very informative network.
The Chinese TV viewers tend to associate Iceland with a term, bankrupt state, a state that went bankrupt. But most economists
this is coming back to Gordon Brown. I mean, he went on television, global television, and said Iceland was bankrupt, which was utter nonsense, completely wrong, as we have proved in the following years. But that statement did an extraordinary damage to a number of Icelandic businesses all over the world, because everybody believed his statement. And I personally thought it was highly irresponsible to declare another country bankrupt.
Your version of it, national insolvency?
No, that never happened. That never happened. Iceland has always repaid all its sovereign debt, completely. Always. There's never been a question of Iceland repaying or not repaying its sovereign debt. The only question was whether private banks that had their base in Iceland, their home base, but operated according to European rule within other European countries. That was the nature of the European banking system, that banks were able to operate anywhere within the European market. So the question was, if those banks fail, as banks always do we in Europe have a banking system which is such that if the banks succeed, the shareholders and the bankers get extraordinarily rich? But if these private banks fail, then the bill should be sent to ordinary people, as I said before, farmers and fishermen and teachers and nurses in their home country? Of course not. Because if that is the nature of the European banking system, it encourages extraordinarily irresponsible behavior on behalf of the bankers, because they know they can take any risk they want to do. If they succeed, they themselves get a great fortune. But if they fail, other people will pay the cost. So that was the core of our dispute.
I understand now. And the word national bankruptcy should never have been associated with Iceland.
It was highly irresponsible and confrontational to use that, because it was absolutely and utterly without foundation, as the track record of my country in the last 4 years has so clearly demonstrated.
When Iceland's top banks collapsed within the space of a week in 2008, the country adopted a strategy to compensate local savers. However, efforts to compensate overseas savers proved to be a less smooth process. The Icelandic parliament passed legislation in 2010 and 2011 to compensate depositors in Britain and the Netherlands, which had bailed out their troubled banks. But both bills were vetoed by the Icelandic president, Olafur Ragnar Grimsson, who insisted on putting them to referendums. As expected, Icelandic voters resoundingly said no to the repayment deals. Grimsson says the two referendums gave his people increased self-confidence, but it wreaked havoc on regional ties. The Brits and the Dutch were furious by the decision, and Grimsson became a target for criticism from both domestic and overseas politicians. Still, he He won broad support from ordinary people within Iceland, and his policy secured him a record 5th presidential term, making him the longest-serving president in Iceland's history. In addition to the repayment dispute, the fishing industry is putting another strain on Iceland-UK relations. As an economy heavily reliant on fishing, Iceland's extensions of fishing zones in the North Atlantic in the 1950s and 1970s led to a series of confrontations with the United Kingdom. Due to differences on fishing policies, Iceland has slowed down its bid to join the European Union.
£5 billion to be paid or not to be paid. There was referendum, and that also created a bit of bitterness between Icelanders and the people in the UK. Which led to some diplomatic issues as well. So should we say now things have been okay?
Well, first of all, you are absolutely right. My country was hit very hard by the collapse of the banks and the financial crisis. But now, 4 years later, we are back on the track of recovery in a very effective way, more than any other European country that was hit by the financial crisis, with strong economic growth by European standards and very little unemployment compared to many other European countries. So by following different policies than other European countries, we are now enjoying a recovery much sooner and more effectively than anybody could have expected. The dispute with Britain and the Netherlands on the so-called ISAVE issue was based on the question whether individual people in my country, farmers, fishermen, teachers and nurses, should be made responsible through their taxes for the failure of a private bank, which was a private business company in their country. That is why I decided to have 2 referendums. But what has happened since the referendums took place, where the people of Iceland said, no, we are not willing as taxpayers to shoulder the burden of this private bank, the estate of the failed bank has been sufficiently rich to start paying back to the depositors and to the British authorities and the Dutch authorities. And in the end, within a few years, they will have paid back all the deposits.
But not yet.
No, they have already paid about a half or so. So the process has already started. It's being very effective. So it's no longer a question of paying or not paying. But it is proper that it should be the estate of the failed private bank which is responsible for the repayment. And unfortunately, the assets within the bank turned out to be sufficiently rich in order to enable the estate to do so. So if everybody had been wise 3 or 4 years ago and said, let's wait and see what assets are within this bank, we could have escaped this difficult political issue between our countries.
And the page has been turned. There's no diplomatic strife whatsoever.
Oh no, we never had any dispute with the people of Britain. Britain has been our close ally and our close partner in many ways.
Would you consider the financial crisis the single biggest challenge in your career as the president of your country?
Absolutely. Absolutely. For a number of reasons. And I think the problem is that most people discuss the financial crisis purely in economic terms or financial terms. But what we experienced in my country was that when the banks collapsed and we were hit by this financial thunderstorm, after a few weeks it started to threaten the fundamental basis of our democracy, started to threaten our political structure, our peaceful daily life.
In a matter of months?
Yes, there were riots. The police had to defend the parliament. The police had to defend the central bank. The police had to defend the prime minister's office. The police had to stand there day and night. And it demonstrated that the collapse of the financial system can threaten one of the most peaceful and secure democracies and political systems that exist in the world.
And turn some of the happiest people in the world into...
Exactly. So, towards the end of 2008 and the beginning of 2009, what I feared most when I woke up in the morning was not whether we would recover from the financial crisis, because I knew we would. It was a question of time. But my greatest fear was whether the impact of the collapse of the financial institution would destroy our political system, would it destroy our peaceful democracy. Because if that was broken, nobody had an experience in putting that together again. And those were the most difficult times of my entire career and life. And then the single most difficult decision was, of course, to put the ISAFE law to a referendum. Because every government in Europe was against my decision. And a lot of people were saying that if I allowed the people to vote, it would isolate Iceland in the international financial world. We would become a pariah state. Nobody wanted to deal with us. There were all kinds of doomsday scenarios. And I decided there was no way that I would not support the will of the people, because that was more fundamental to our society than financial markets.
But has that experience, how has that experience taught you the right way to regulate the banks, the bankers?
Well, I hope so, but it has also taught me once again to trust the people, that the people have a great wisdom when they come together, and no leader should ignore the strong will of his or her people.
And the banking sector, the bankers and the banking sector, the financial regulators will survive the crisis, or have survived the crisis, with a very new, different mentality.
Well, definitely. I think everybody has learned from the crisis. I hope everybody has learned.
And the financial sector shall never be over-liberalized ever again.
No, I don't think so.
The Arctic, a part of the world that appears barren, harsh, and inhospitable to most. But underneath this vast world lies much coveted natural resources. By some estimates, the Arctic boasts a quarter of the world's oil and gas resources, with minerals worth $2 trillion. It's also expected to be able to produce 10% of the world's diamonds. The Arctic is also a potential transport hub. According to a report compiled by think tank the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, a commercially navigable Arctic Ocean will remarkably shorten intercontinental navigation routes, and that also means markedly lower transport costs. Its resource richness and strategic position makes the Arctic a much coveted location for nearby nations. The battle for it started as early as the 1950s and reached a peak in early August 2007, when a Russian submarine famously planted a flag on the Arctic seafloor underneath the North Pole. The flag stunt, mounted by State Duma deputy and polar explorer Artur Chlingarov, was seen as heralding a race for the Arctic. The move attracted criticism from other Arctic neighbors. Some took immediate countermeasures. Days later, the United States and Denmark both dispatched scientific exploration teams to the North Pole region, while Canada announced a plan to build 2 military bases in the area. As a less assertive member country of the Arctic Council, how does Iceland perceive the escalating fight for the Arctic?
Territorial disputes are making world news, headline news, all the time, and more recently so than other times. And I understood that in Arctic countries, among Arctic countries, sometimes you have disputes as well when it comes to how to develop common area and which country has a right to a particular land in the Arctic area. What would you consider as some common principles that can apply?
Well, this is a very interesting question, and I would encourage people in Asia, Africa, and other parts of the world to study very closely the developments in the Arctic in the last 10, 15 years. Because if you go back 20 years or so to the end of the Cold War, the Arctic was one of the most militarized areas in the world. It was an area where fundamental conflict between East and West, between the Soviet Union and the United States, between the Warsaw Pact and NATO took place. There were military bases all over, there were missiles, there were air forces, there were submarines, you name it. It was a territory highly dominated by the potential military confrontation. In less than 2 decades, we have managed to transform the Arctic into one of the most constructive and positive areas of cooperation. In fact, I don't think within the Arctic area there are going to be any disputes of the kind that you refer to.
I see. And what might be Iceland or Arctic countries' attitude towards China's ideas about the Arctic region?
Well, I have always said that China has a very legitimate interest in the Arctic for 2 fundamental reasons. First, scientific research has shown that the melting of the Arctic sea ice causes extreme weather in China in the following winter. The second reason why China, in my opinion, has a legitimate interest in the Arctic is that in this century, China will be the paramount trading country in the world.
Iceland has long had close ties with China. With diplomatic relations established in 1971, Iceland is the first Western European nation to acknowledge China's market economy status and the first European country to hold free trade talks with China. In April 2012, the 2 countries announced a joint plan to develop the resource-rich Arctic. The Icelandic government says the cooperation is a win-win situation for the 2 countries. In late 2011, proposed investment deal from a Chinese real estate mogul became the center of media spotlight worldwide. But the bid for a land purchase in the country proved not so simple. After the proposal was rejected by the Icelandic Interior Ministry for legal reasons, the Icelandic government offered to change the term buying to renting.
你不卖我了，是租我，那我给你付钱的方式，我就不能一下子给，我希望就是按照每年的租金给。对冰岛来说，就解决了他们国内的一些人的看法，说我们国家这么小，把这么大块土地卖给一个外国人了，这个问题就规避开了。
Bilateral trade relations are also moving forward. In January, China and Iceland held the 6th round of free trade area talks in Beijing, and an agreement is expected this year. Some experts say a bilateral free trade agreement with Iceland will help bolster China's efforts for reaching such a deal with the European Union.
Another issue that's been associated with Iceland, which has made news in China, which could be a promotional marketing trick of a Chinese businessman, Mr. Huang, who has been telling the Chinese press he's trying to invest in Iceland, buying or renting land, and eventually didn't happen. So it raised doubts about the Iceland's government's attitude towards Chinese investment.
No, first of all, there's a very positive attitude in Iceland towards China as an economic and business partner, demonstrated by the fact that one of the largest industrial companies in Iceland, the ferrosilicon plant, is in fact owned by China. And there was never any objection to that big investment by China in the Icelandic economy. We have also engaged in business cooperation with respect to geothermal power, both within China and potentially elsewhere. Sinopec is a very strong partner for Icelandic engineering and energy companies in this respect. This question you refer to, which became famous in the media, partly I think because he decided to publicize it, was that as we are a member of the European Economic Area, our laws and regulations are such that if you are a citizen of a European country, you can buy property and invest anywhere in Europe. But if you come from Canada, United States, India, China, Africa, Latin America, you have to apply in a formal way. The respective ministries, the national and the local authorities have to investigate your plan. And of course this was a very big project in a big part of Iceland, which potentially would have had a lot of financial and other implications. So it was only natural that the ministries and the local authorities would examine this in a very thorough way. They would have done so in any case. So it's nothing to do with being pro and anti-China. No.
Of course, but is there any particular part of that deal that made local authorities in Iceland uncomfortable or acceptable?
No, I think, in fact, if I remember correctly, I think the discussions are still going on. I think the ministries in their last communication to him asked for further details and descriptions of the plans. To the best of my knowledge, I think that is the state of play, that he has been asked to provide more detailed information about his investment plan and also how he is going to fulfill the various obligations.
And China and Iceland have every reason to realize free trade.
This is something which I have taken a very strong interest in. When I did my first state visit to China in 2005, this was one of the major issues. And since then, it has taken a long time to negotiate, partly perhaps due to the results of the financial crisis in my own country. But in the recent months, there have been a number of meetings. There have been Chinese negotiating delegations coming to Iceland. And we do sincerely hope that within the very near future, we will be able to conclude the free trade agreement.
Thank you, President.
Thank you very much.